So it's true that I'm a political appointee for, or was a political appointee for 2 Democratic presidents and 2 Republican presidents, which I think it's fair to say makes me an extinct species. I'm hoping at some point we'll find that, in fact, being appointed across both sides is something that's acceptable, and I suspect policymaking will be a whole lot better if we can return to that kind of a posture. So look, I'm going to talk about the book tonight, but I thought I would start by talking a little bit about where we are in the region, a little bit about ISIS, how to think about ISIS, what it is, and then I'll relate it back to the book. And one of the things I'm going to do during the course of this is I will engage you. I'll pose some questions to you. Now, I do that because it's also my teaching style. One of the things I always tell my students is one of the reasons I pose questions is they may not always remember what I say, but they'll always remember what they say. And I'll engage you tonight, partly because it'll make it more interesting for you, and even more importantly, it'll make it more interesting for me. All right, so let me start just by talking about ISIS. ISIS is a group that fundamentally sees itself as representing and embodying the pure form of Islam. Its case is that it's the one group that can perfect Islam. The existence of what they call the Islamic State and the existence of a caliph, they say, is a manifestation of the achievement of what the Prophet wants, and they portray themselves as being the only true interpreters of Islam and of the Prophet. They define Shia Muslims, literally the Arabic term they use for it means rejecter, but they also look at Sunni Muslims who don't embrace them as also being apostates. Now they look at us, our mere existence, as a threat to them. They actually have a magazine. Can you turn this down a little bit? Because I hear a big echo. I don't know about you, but I hear an echo. Can you turn it down a little? I'm fine with hearing myself, but not more than once. Is that better? For me too. Okay. So the essence of their position is that they have a divine mandate. I was about to say they have a magazine called Dabiq, which is actually the name of a city in Syria, which is supposedly, according to the Quran, is supposedly where there will be an end of days kind of scenario, where there will be a cataclysmic conflict with all the non-believers. And after you have that cataclysmic conflict, there'll be a great cleansing. And then there'll only be a kind of purity of Islam that will exist. So for them, they have to fight us. For those who say, well, if we just weren't in the Middle East, they wouldn't fight us. No, they have to confront us because it's part of who they are and part of their ideology. So when the president talks about defeating them, he's right. When the president talks about destroying them, he's right. The only problem is we actually can't destroy them. We can set them back. And when they lose territory militarily, it's a problem for them because they claim to have a divine mandate. So if you have a divine mandate, how can you be losing territory? How can you be losing at all? Now, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi sent out a message last week in which he was explaining that, in fact, some losses are to be expected because he described it as being the sign that they are being tested. And the Prophet tests them. Allah tests them. And so this was to be expected. When there was a setback in Ramadi, it was to be expected. Now, the truth is, the more we set them back, the harder it is for them to claim they have a divine mandate, but that won't be enough to discredit them. To discredit them, we have to have the Sunnis. And we won't have the Sunnis First of all, if we're seen as in partnership with Iran, the tension you see between Saudi Arabia and Iran right now, this is very much a part of what is the struggle between Sunni and Shia, between Arabs and Persians, but particularly in the context of ISIS. If we are seen as being partners with Iran, that actually plays to the ISIS narrative. ISIS actually talks about a gray zone. And when they talk about a gray zone, what they mean by the gray zone is that there are those Muslims out there who live in a gray zone. One of the reasons they want to create polarization is to bring those Muslims back into their sphere. If we want to discredit ISIS, we can't do it. No non-Muslim can do it. It has to be Sunni Muslims who will do it. Until we have a coherent policy on Syria, we will find it very difficult to discredit them because we will not have Sunni partners. Right now, as we do more in Syria against ISIS, and that's only who we're attacking in Syria is ISIS, and as the Russians do more in Syria against all the non-ISIS Sunni opposition, it looks in the Sunni world as if there's an onslaught on Sunnis. So unless our approach to Syria becomes one where it looks like we're doing something to protect Sunnis, as opposed to being part of an onslaught against Sunnis, we won't have Sunni governments, we won't have Sunni tribes, and ultimately that's going to be the key to being able to discredit ISIS. Setting them back militarily is important. It's not a substitute for having Sunnis take on the responsibility and the role of discrediting them. And the key to that will be what we do mostly in Syria, to a lesser extent in Iraq. I'm happy to get more into that in the Q&A, but I want to set that as a preliminary comment for a simple reason. I want to set up another part of an explanation for you. How many of you have been following what has been the kind of daily acts of terror that have taken place in Israel over the last 4 months? I'm asked all the time, is this a new intifada? It doesn't look like the first or second intifada, because the first and second intifada, which literally means uprising, the first and second intifada were organized, were structures, had a leadership. What you're seeing over the last 4 months with these attacks, they're almost all individualized. Those who carry them out are almost exclusively between the ages of 15 and 25. There is no organization, they have no affiliation, there is no leadership. I say to people all the time, the good news is it's not organized. The bad news is it's not organized. And at this point, it's being driven by a sense of anger, partly because no one's paying attention to them. In the Middle East, no one is paying attention to them. The Saudis are focused on the Iranians. That's their main preoccupation. Egypt is focused on the radical Islamists within Egypt. You have a proxy war in Syria, you have a proxy war in Yemen, you have Libya imploding. There's a perception that Iran is on the march. No one is paying attention to the Palestinians. So the Arabs aren't paying attention to them. That's a source of anger. Their own leadership is seen as largely corrupt. If you look at Palestinian polls, 80% feel the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. 66% would like to see Abu Mazen leave. So they're angry at their own leadership, and they're angry at the Israelis. Now, when you began to see these attacks, and I want to say something about these attacks. Think about, most of the attacks have been stabbings. If you think about it, there is nothing that is more intimate in terms of an act of terror than a stabbing. You see your victim. Literally, this is bloodletting. It isn't like what happened in Paris where you go into a hall and you shoot it up, or you set off a suicide vest. There's almost an abstraction to this. This is not abstract. This is highly personalized, even if you don't know the person you're stabbing. It is an intimate form of terror. Now, the administration, when it first reacted to it, for the first 10 days or so, when it commented on it, it talked about a cycle of violence. Was there a cycle of violence? It wasn't a cycle of violence. There was stabbings that were being carried out. And the first victims were almost all civilians. That's much less true now, but that's what it was. The administration, it took a long time for the administration to finally refer to this as terror. For the first period of time, everything was calling for calm and an end to the cycle of violence. They weren't calling it terror. Why was that? The questions I'm asking right now, I'm going to answer. And by the way, one good thing for you to know, every question that I pose, I can answer. There was a reason that they didn't want to say terror. There was a reason they didn't want to somehow be seen as criticizing only the Palestinians. So they brought the Israelis into it. Now, I'm raising this because this mindset that, in a sense, couldn't bring itself and reflect itself in terms of statements and policy, couldn't bring itself to be seen as criticizing only the Palestinians. This is a mindset that is not unique to the Obama administration. In every administration, from Truman to Obama, there has been a constituency that looked at Israel through the lens of being a problem, not a partner. In every administration. In fact, there was only one administration in which that mindset that saw Israel was a problem, not a partner, in only one administration did that constituency and that mindset not have any influence. So my first question to you is, in which administration did this mindset that saw Israel as a problem, in which administration did this mindset, that group, that constituency have no influence? It existed, but there was only one administration in which it had no influence. Reagan administration? No. Did you? Hang on, one at a time. Who said? Someone said Carter? Carter. Let me repeat the point. The issue here was a constituency that saw Israel as a problem and they had no influence. In the Carter administration, the only constituency that existed, constituency, not individuals, John, constituency, not individuals, the entire national security establishment at the top of the Carter administration saw Israel exclusively as a problem. I'm talking about which administration did George W. Bush. Who said George W. Bush? George W. Bush is a very good guess. In fact, it's an excellent guess. It's wrong, but it's an excellent guess. And in fact, if President Obama was here, he would probably answer the question the same way. In July of 2009, President Obama had Jewish leaders into the White House, and one of those leaders, actually Malcolm Hoenlein, who you had here last month, Malcolm Hoenlein said to the president, look, if you want the Israelis to move on peace, you need to be right next to them. They need to know that you support them. And President Obama said, for 8 years there was no daylight between the Bush administration and Israel, and the Israelis sat on the sideline and did nothing, and it cost us with the Arabs. That's what the president said. So he would have answered my question the same way you did. Now, what's interesting about the answer is it's wrong on, that answer would have been wrong on 2 counts. The first one was, in fact, Israel during the Bush administration did 2 very big things on the Palestinian issue. Ariel Sharon withdrew unilaterally from all of Gaza, 100%. And when he did that, he withdrew from 4 small settlements in the West Bank as well. And he did it why? Well, actually because he was close. He felt close to Bush. Ehud Olmert in 2008 went beyond the Clinton parameters in terms of what he offered to settle the conflict with the Palestinians. I know something about the Clinton parameters because I was their principal author. And what Olmert offered went beyond the Clinton parameters. That was because also he was close to Bush. So the fact that there was closeness actually produced big Israeli moves. They were not sitting on the sidelines. So what the president described was wrong historically. But the reason the answer on Bush is wrong is because, in fact, that constituency that saw Israel as a problem had major weight. and especially early on. In President Bush's first phone call to Ariel Sharon after 9/11, after Bush had declared a war on terror, in that first call, he was pressing Sharon to have his then Foreign Minister Shimon Peres see Yasser Arafat. And at the time, terror was quite alive. Second Intifada was underway. There were bombs going off in Israel. Bush would not have dreamed of talking to those responsible for 9/11, but he was pressing the Prime Minister of Israel to have his foreign minister see Yasser Arafat, who bore a great responsibility for the violence that was underway at that point. Now, he did it because he was being, within the upper reaches of his administration, from the State Department, from the intelligence community, from some within the White House, there was a perception that 9/11 took place because we were too close to Israel. 9/11 took place because we weren't doing anything on the Palestinian issue, and we wouldn't have partners in the war on terror unless we could do something about the Palestinian issue. So that constituency had a lot of influence. Now, it is true over time, Bush evolves. He begins to say, hey, I can't have one set of rules for us when it comes to the war on terror and a different set of rules for the Israelis. And he writes about this, by the way, in his memoir, that he changes, that he evolves. And over time, that constituency doesn't go away, but the scope of what they want and their impact is limited, typically by Bush and his own instincts. And Bush really does evolve. He does not come in as a great friend of Israel. He does not. But he becomes one. He gives a speech in 2008 to the Israeli parliament, in May of 2008, where he says, you may think you're 7 million, but you're really 307 million because you have us. So he changes, he evolves, but that's not how he comes in. Okay, so I didn't answer the question. So who is the one administration? No, it's Clinton. Somebody said, who said Clinton? You're right. It was Clinton. It was Clinton. Clinton believed that we were Israel's only friend. And as Israel's only friend in the world, we could have differences with the Israelis, but you shouldn't make them public. Because if you made them public, you sent a message to all of Israel's enemies that a wedge could be driven between the United States and Israel, and you would weaken Israel's deterrent. You would make conflict more likely, you would make peace less likely. And that was, for him, an article of faith. All right, so Clinton was the answer. All right, we're kind of on a roll, so I'm asking another question. All right, I promised you I was going to engage you. All right, so which was the administration that was toughest on the Israelis? From Truman to Obama? Carter? No, but good guess. Bush 1? No, but good guess. Which one, John? Bush 1? No. Nixon? A very interesting guess. We're going to get to that, but no. Who said Eisenhower? All right, Eisenhower is the answer. Eisenhower comes in. Eisenhower is convinced that Truman was completely imbalanced when it came to this issue. In fact, he believed that Truman was governed entirely by political factors and the Jewish vote. And the reason he believed it was because Truman recognized Israel over the opposition of the entire national security establishment. Many of you may have heard of the so-called wise men. These are people like George C. Marshall, George Kennan, all of the wise men who created the institutions of the Cold War. Every single one of them were against the recognition of the State of Israel, but Truman recognized. In fact, Howard, you asked if I was going to talk about Truman, so I'm going to tell a story about Truman. On May 12th, 3 days before the British were to complete their withdrawal, May 12th, 1948, 3 days before the British were to complete their withdrawal from Palestine, and there was reason to believe that the Yeshiv, the Jewish community in Palestine, was going to declare itself a state, Truman has a meeting. And he has Marshall come, and he has Robert Lovett, the undersecretary, come, and he has Clark Clifford, his domestic political counselor, come. And Marshall comes in, and the meeting is about what to do when the Jews declare themselves a state. And Marshall gives a presentation, says, we shouldn't recognize, we should have a trusteeship. And Lovett reinforces and says, look, the Jews are basically, they're all socialists, which means they'll be an agent of the Soviet Union. And the president turns to Clifford to answer this. And the first thing that happens is Secretary Marshall says, why is he here? This is a foreign policy meeting. He's a domestic political counselor. And Truman says, well, I asked him. And he says, would you proceed and explain your point of view? Now, the truth is, Clifford has written 2 memos, one in March and one in May, making the case for recognition. And he says all the arguments against recognition, he literally says they're simply wrong-headed. And he proceeds to recount the arguments that he's made in these memos. The first thing, he dismisses what Levitt says, they're all communist agents, they're going to be an outlet for the Soviet Union. He says, look, they're trying to get away from the Soviet Union. They want freedom. The last thing they want is to be dominated by the Soviet Union. But that's not his main argument. He says, first of all, notwithstanding what the intelligence community had said, because in fact the intelligence community the day before the partition vote in the UN, real surprise, real coincidence, they come out with a finding saying a Jewish state couldn't survive. If you want a Jewish state to survive, it'll take 500,000 American troops. I'll just tell you, for anybody who's ever worked in the government, the surest way to kill any proposal is say it'll take 500,000 American troops to come in and do it. So it's just a coincidence that the day before the partition vote, this is what the CIA comes out with. Well, George Kennan, who I referred to before, and Loy Henderson, there's an auditorium not quite the size in the State Department named for him. They do a memo in January that repeats this, a Jewish state couldn't possibly survive. It will require hundreds of thousands of American troops to sustain it. They can never survive on their own. So Marshall takes that on and he says, not only without any help from us, because we have an arms embargo on them, so they can't get any arms from us, they have created a fact. They're in a stronger position today than they were before. We haven't done a damn thing for them, and yet there they are. So if you don't recognize them, you're penalizing them for having created a fact when we said they couldn't. So he said, you need to recognize because it's a fact and it's the right thing to do, number one. Number two, he says, those who say the minute we do this, the Arabs will stop providing us oil. The Arabs can't drink their oil. The Saudis sell it to us because and they need the royalties from it, what we do, so they have to sell it to us. He's about to make his third argument, where he's saying, if we were to give in to Arab threats of violence, that's appeasement and will have no credibility anywhere in the world. And at that point, Marshall cuts him off. And he says, these are all political arguments. And if you, Mr. President, were to accept what he's saying, and if I were to vote in the upcoming presidential election, I would vote against you. George C. Marshall, lifelong soldier, says if I were to vote as if he never votes, right, because he's a soldier. And this is what he says. Well, that, not surprisingly, casts a pall over the meeting. And so there's a kind of silence, and the president says, well, General, I'm inclined to agree with you. In fact, what happens after the meeting, Lovett, even though Lovett supports the Secretary's position on the substance, is deeply troubled by what looks like a real breach between the Secretary of State and the President. So that night he goes to see Clifford at his place, and they work out an understanding that there'll be no recognition prior to the declaration, but after the declaration we will recognize. And what's the irony here is we do recognize. 11 minutes after the declaration, Truman recognizes. By the way, he surprises his own representatives at the UN, who at the very moment he recognizes are giving a speech in the UN in favor of trusteeship. So Truman, it takes courage to do what Truman does. But we don't, by the way, this was de facto recognition, it's not legal recognition, de jure recognition. We don't do that until after Israel has its first election on January 31, 1949. They go through wars through the rest of 48. We don't provide any economic assistance to them, and we don't formally recognize until about 8 months later. And we never provide arms. during Truman's tenure. And notwithstanding that, Eisenhower believes that we did what we did, Truman did what he did only for political reasons. So when he comes in, he is determined to change our approach to the Middle East. He's going to make it balanced. He's going to make it reflective of our real interests, and our real interests are with the Arabs. When his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, takes a 3-week trip to the Middle East in the spring, he goes and his first stop is in Lebanon. And when he sees the Lebanese president, he says to him, unlike the Democrats, we don't owe anything to the Jews. By the way, what I'm quoting now, all right? He says, we don't owe anything to them, and we can pursue our real interests. And our real interests lie with the Arabs. And he says, he goes beyond that, and he says, and we will be prepared to counteract Israeli aggression. All right, this is 1953. Are there any occupied territories in 1953? It's a rhetorical question. Israel's surrounded by countries who reject its existence, and ironically, with the exception of Lebanon, every one of them supports Fedayeen, terror attacks into Israel. And Dulles is saying, we will counteract Israeli aggression. This is the mindset. In 1956, during the Suez War, we author a Security Council resolution condemning the Israelis and demanding that they immediately withdraw. It's the British and the French, because they have basically colluded with the Israelis on this attack against Nasser, because the French see Nasser being behind the uprising within Algeria. The British see the nationalization of the Suez Canal, as Anthony Eden, then the Prime Minister, says, it's a bone in the throat of the British Empire. And so the British and the French actually veto our resolution against Israel. It's the last time they veto a resolution in favor of Israel. And we adopt a General Assembly resolution. The President, Eisenhower, actually contemplates using American force to expel the Israelis from the Sinai. He threatens the Israelis with sanctions. He has his Undersecretary of State, Herbert Hoover Jr., call in the Israeli ambassador and say, if you don't pull out, he threatens expulsion from the UN. It was Herbert Hoover instead of John Foster Dulles, because a couple days into the war, John Foster Dulles suffered an acute abdominal attack, which turned out to be the cancer that eventually kills him. But this is pretty tough stuff. Now, he doesn't suspend weapons to Israel because, by the way, Eisenhower will never provide weapons to Israel. At the time, the Soviets, starting in 1955, begin to provide massive arms to Egypt and to Syria. We won't provide any arms to Israel. Every Israeli request is met with a suggestion that Israel should seek the goodwill of their neighbors. That will provide their security. These are their neighbors, all of whom reject their existence. All right, so Eisenhower is pretty tough. But as I said, Eisenhower doesn't suspend any weapons because he doesn't provide any weapons to Israel. So I'm going to ask you another question. We're on a roll, or at least I'm on a roll, so I'm going to ask more questions. All right, so which is the one administration? There's one administration that suspends weapons to Israel as a punishment. Which administration suspended weapons to Israel as a punishment? And I'll give you a hint. The weapons that were suspended were F-16s. So which administration suspended weapons to Israel as a punishment? No? Your question, the guess of Nixon, I'm going to come back to Nixon because Nixon actually does suspend weapons, but not as a punishment. But I'll come back and explain it. There is one administration that suspends F-16s to Israel as a punishment. Not Ford. Who? What? I can't hear you. No, not Bush 41. Reagan. Who said Reagan? Reagan. It's Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan suspends F-16s to Israel after the Israelis bombed the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq. He suspends F-16s. When by the way, later on, he talks about, well, maybe it wasn't such a bad idea after all that they did it, but he suspends F-16s to Israel as a punishment over bombing the Osirak reactor. Then when he resumes the supply in the fall of 1981, he suspends them again in December of 1981 when Menachem Begin extends Israel's law and administration to the Golan Heights, effectively annexing the Golan Heights. And Reagan sees this as a violation of Security Council Resolution 242, and he suspends F-16s. Now, that's not the low point of the Reagan administration with Israel. The low point of the Reagan administration with Israel comes in the summer of 1982 during the Israeli siege of Beirut. At that time, by the way, Caspar Weinberger wants to break relations with Israel. That's pretty amazing, wants to break relations with Israel. That was Caspar Weinberger. That was his suggestion during the siege of Beirut. During the siege of Beirut, there are a number of times when Reagan actually threatens the future of the relationship. Reagan, in the end, turns around. The Reagan administration becomes the transformative administration when it comes to the U.S.-Israeli relationship, from a standpoint of building an institutional structure of cooperation. Prior to that time, it doesn't really exist. He turns around, you may recall, we had the bombing of our embassy in April of 1983, probably by Hezbollah. We had the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in October of 1983. In the aftermath of these, Reagan looks and says, all right, the Syrians are behind this. The Soviets are backing the Syrians. Our real friends are the Israelis. By the way, in May of 1983, the Israelis have agreed to withdraw from Lebanon in a mission that George Shultz brokers if the Syrians will do so, and the Syrians reject doing so, and the Syrians pressure to change the Lebanese government for having agreed to this. So Reagan turns around. In January 1984, he basically signs a document that creates something called the Joint Political Military Group, which becomes an umbrella for creating an architecture of security and strategic cooperation with Israel. Hadn't existed before. It's Reagan who does it. Reagan goes back to his roots. I say Reagan goes back to his roots because Reagan feels an emotional commitment to Israel. Notwithstanding what I've just said about what happens the first 2 years of the administration, he comes in with a feeling of an emotional commitment to Israel. During the AWACS fight, which Reagan is convinced the U.S. needs to do to sell AWACS to Saudi Arabia, and Israel opposes it and launches a campaign in the Congress against it, Reagan wins it. Reagan gives a very tough press conference on October 1, 1981, in which he says, it isn't the business of foreign countries to make American foreign policy. And this is a response to Israel and Israel's supporters against AWACS. People don't remember Reagan that way because Reagan transforms the relationship. I said he goes back to his roots. In Reagan's case, during World War II, Reagan did training films. That's what he did in service, and in that capacity, he was among the first to see the films of the liberation of the death camps. He was so horrified by them that he kept them. He tells George Shultz when he's president, and Shultz is secretary, he kept them because they were so horrible, he thought no one would ever believe it. And he feels, because of that, he feels a moral obligation to Israel. He writes in his diary during the AWACS fight, don't they realize they have the best friend they've ever had in the White House, meaning the Israelis? So he has these roots and he goes back to them after the bombing of our embassy in April of 83 in Beirut, and then the bombing of the Marine barracks. It isn't just that he establishes a security architecture, an architecture of cooperation with Israel that, by the way, every president since that time has built on. Even if they didn't have the emotional connection to Israel, it isn't just that he does that. It's that he, in his administration for the first time, you actually see not individuals who might view the Middle East differently, but a constituency emerges that represents a countervailing view. I said in every administration, I start off by saying in every administration, from Truman to Obama, you had a constituency that looked at Israel as being a problem and not a partner. From Reagan's time on, you have a countervailing constituency that sees Israel as a partner and not a problem. And from that time on, there's a kind of struggle between these two constituencies in the making of policy towards Israel and the Middle East. Now, there are three assumptions that have been embedded in the national security bureaucracy from Truman's time until today. And they highlight, in a sense, some of the fallacies that have driven some of the policy, and I want to talk about those. I want to highlight them by giving you some examples of them from different administrations, and I'm going to show you how some of these assumptions connect to today. And one of the things I do in the book is I talk about events that have echoes that reverberate over time. All right, so the first of the assumptions, I'll give you the three assumptions. The first assumption is that if we distance from Israel, we will gain with the Arabs. And by the way, 5 administrations have done that. If you distance from Israel, you gain with the Arabs. Eisenhower distanced, thinking we would gain with the Arabs. Nixon distanced, thinking we would gain with the Arabs. Carter distanced, thinking we would gain with the Arabs. Bush 41 distanced, thinking we would gain with the Arabs. And Obama distanced, thinking we would gain with the Arabs. First assumption. Second assumption is a corollary to it. If you cooperate with Israel, you will lose with the Arabs. And the third assumption is, if you want to transform the American position in the Middle East, and if you want to transform the Middle East itself, you have to solve the Palestinian problem. It's the key to everything. Those three assumptions have been embedded from Truman's time on. And I want to give you a few examples of how they played out in practice and how wrong they were, but the lessons weren't learned. All right, so I said, distance from Israel, you gain with the Arabs. Clearly, Obama in the first 6 months of the administration did that. And he actually took a trip before he went to Cairo, he stopped in Saudi Arabia, having distance from Israel, having made a big deal of the settlement issue. He asked the Saudis, look what I've done, asked the Saudis to respond and be prepared to take a gesture towards the Israelis, and what he heard was, at that time, no, and we'll be the last to make peace. But this is, by the way, not the most egregious example of distancing with the expectation that you'll gain with the Arabs. The most egregious example is Nixon. Nixon suspends F-4 Phantoms to Israel in March of 1970. He does it not as a punishment. He does it because he wants to reach out to Nasser. And he hopes that that by doing this, by suspending the F-4s that had been promised by Johnson to Israel, that Nasser will respond favorably. A perfect example of this premise: if you distance from Israel, you gain with the Arabs. Now, what makes it egregious is that he did it at the very moment that the Soviets, for the first time in their history, were sending their military personnel outside the Eastern Bloc, outside the Warsaw Pact, to Egypt. So he sends his Undersecretary of State, Joe Sisko, to see Nasser, say, look what we've done. I've stopped the arms. I'm not sending Phantoms to Israel. So let's create a connection now. You should respond to us. And Sisko goes out there, and to use the diplomatic terminology for this, Nasser blows him off. He makes increasing demands. Not a surprise. All right. I said the second assumption was, the corollary of that is, if you cooperate with the Israelis, you lose with the Arabs. So the first administration to provide arms to Israel is the Kennedy administration. Kennedy provides Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, purely a defensive weapon system, because you use it against bombers that might be attacking your sites. In this case, the Israelis use their air force to cover the mobilization of what is a small standing army. And the increasing bombers that were going to the Egyptians in particular made the Israelis desperate to get Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. They requested them throughout the Eisenhower administration. They didn't get them from the Eisenhower administration. But Kennedy decides in 1962 that there's an imbalance, and if we don't do it, we actually make war more likely. You're weakening Israel's deterrent. This was Kennedy. Now, before he makes it clear he's contemplating it, the opposition to this within the administration is overwhelming, at least from the State Department and the intelligence community. There are cables that are sent in from our posts in the Middle East that talk about how the sky will fall. Literally, the sky will fall if we do this. It'll be the end of our relations with the Arabs if we do this. Dean Rusk, who's the Secretary of State, says this will set a terrible precedent and cause grave damage to our relations with the Arabs. So as luck would have it for Dean Rusk, who says this is going to be a terrible precedent, cause grave damage, the day he's scheduled to see, in fact, he's going to see the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Faisal, in New York at the opening of the UN General Assembly session. Same day he's supposed to see him is the day the news of this leaks out. So, he feels like he's drawing the short straw, right? He's got to go see Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who, by the way, Faisal is actually the real power in Saudi Arabia. He will soon replace, at that time, King Saud. And so he goes in, and what does he hear? Does Faisal offer him, say, the diplomatic equivalent of "you're dead to me"? That's it, we're finished? I mean, that was the logic of the argument. What do you think? Does he do that? It's true, it was a rhetorical question. He doesn't even raise it. What does he raise? He raises the coup that's taken place in Yemen that is basically backed by Nasser. He says that Nasser is trying to gain a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula to threaten Saudi Arabia. And what does he say? He asks for arms from us and security assurances. So even though we're going to provide Hawks to the Israelis, the Saudi focuses on what threatens them. All right, he comes down to Washington a week later to see President Kennedy. So maybe in that intervening week, he's come to his senses. He understands what the State Department is saying about how this is a disaster for our relations with the Arabs. So when he comes in to see President Kennedy, does he now raise this? Does he now rail against it? Does he now say, unless you do that, our relationship is finished? Is that what he does? Is that what he does? It's a rhetorical question. No, what he does is he comes in and he says, you know what your problem with your policy is? Your outreach to Egypt. We were providing, at this time, PL 480 funds, which is, we provided wheat to Egypt. At this point, we were providing 2/3 of Egypt's bread supply. And Faisal says your outreach to Egypt is freeing up resources. The economic assistance you're providing them is freeing up resources for Nasser to threaten all your friends in the region. What you're doing by supporting Egypt is threatening every American friend. You are changing the balance of power in the region. You are freeing up resources for Egyptian troublemaking. And the only ones who are gaining are our enemies and your enemies in the Soviet Union. So does that sound familiar to you? Does that sound like something maybe you've heard recently? So if you substitute the word Iran for Egypt today, is this not exactly the same conversation that the Saudis have been having with us for the last 2 years related to the nuclear deal, which means sanctions relief, which is actually going to come this month? What does it tell you? What it tells you is Arab leaders have a priority and a preoccupation. And you know what? That preoccupation isn't Israel. The preoccupation is their security and their survival. They may not like the Israelis, they may not like everything we do with the Israelis, but they don't see that as a threat to them. Their regional rivals are the threat to them. In the 50s and 60s, it was Nasser. In the 70s, it was Gaddafi. In the 80s, it was Saddam Hussein. Now it's Iran. Their preoccupation is their security and their survival. They have never made their relationship with us dependent upon what we do with the Israelis. They may not like how Israel can be used against them, but that's not what is their preoccupation. And today, ironically, they see Israel as a bulwark against Iran, and Egypt and Jordan see it as a bulwark not only against Iran, but also against radical Islamists. The last assumption, and I want to kind of wrap it up. The last assumption is you can't transform our position in the region, nor can you transform the region itself unless you solve the Palestinian issue. Now, you're looking at somebody who spent close to 30 years trying to solve the Palestinian issue. So it's not that I don't believe in trying to solve the Palestinian issue. We should try to solve the Palestinian issue. but we shouldn't try to solve it because we think it's going to transform the region. If tomorrow, what it would take is the Moshiach arriving, but if tomorrow you could end the conflict with the Palestinians, which, as I said, there are all sorts of reasons we should work on that, including that Israel shouldn't become a binational state. But if tomorrow you could solve it, would it stop one barrel bomb in Syria? Would it move ISIS back 1 meter in Syria or Iraq? Would it change the radical Islamist threat in Egypt? Would it end the proxy war in Yemen? Would it make Libya less of a failed state? We should try to solve it, but not because it's a game changer in the region. The title of the book is called Doomed to Succeed. Now, most of the time I go into my synagogue and people say, "Can you give us some good news about the Middle East?" I say, "What am I, the Moshiach?" But this book is fundamentally optimistic about the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Doomed to succeed, by definition, is ironic. But it's ironic because there are ups and downs in the relationship, and that's always been a given. But even though there's ups and downs, even though there are differences, if you look at the trajectory of the relationship, it's been constantly on a more favorable direction. And it's going to continue that way. And it's going to continue that way, particularly with the next administration, for a simple reason. Look at this region. This region is going to be characterized by turmoil, uncertainty, and terrible conflict for at least the next 10 years and probably for the next 20 years. And the reason for that is because the conflict that you see in the region today is over identity. Who is going to define it? Who is going to shape it? Who is going to own it? There's a struggle between radical Islamists who are Sunni and Shia. There's a struggle between radical Islamists and non-Islamists. There is basically a struggle for the soul of Islam. There is a struggle that involves sect and tribe and clan. And when you fight about identity, there is nothing more basic, and that's why the violence is so terrible. That's going to characterize this region for the next 10 to 20 years. But Israel will stand out. Think about it. There is one country in the Middle East that, whatever its problems, promises to be basically stable. Why? Because there is one country in the Middle East that is governed by a rule of law. There is one country in the Middle East that has a separation of powers. There is one country in the Middle East that has an independent judiciary. There is one country in the Middle East where there are regularly and unregularly scheduled elections. Where the loser accepts the outcome. There is one country in the Middle East where there's freedom of speech, where there's freedom of assembly, where there's freedom of the press. There's one country in the Middle East where women's rights are respected and where gay rights are respected. In no other country in the Middle East will you see that. There's one country in the Middle East that, whatever its difficulties, it has the means and the political culture to manage it. And that one country is Israel. And in the midst of all this turmoil, that one country will be a pillar for the United States and a pillar for stability. It's why the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Emiratis look at the Israelis today as a bulwark against the threats that they see. So over the next years, that one country in the Middle East, that one country called Israel, is going to continue to have a relationship with us that continues to evolve in a more favorable direction. And that's why the title of this book is called Doomed to Succeed. Thank you very much.